14 centuries ago, the Quran described the heavens and the earth as once being a joined entity before being separated. In 1929, Edwin Hubble discovered the universe is expanding. Did the Quran anticipate modern cosmology, or is this a case of ancient poetic language being reinterpreted after the fact to fit a 20th century discovery? Today, an Islamic scholar and Quranic studies expert debates an astrophysicist and science philosopher who approaches religious claims with a skeptical eye. Here's the format: 2 minutes each for opening statements. Then our main round, cross-examination, timed at 3 minutes per response. After that, a 2-minute rebuttal round. And finally, 5 minutes each for closing statements. No winner will be declared. Just 2 rigorous cases, for you to weigh. So, did the Quran predict the Big Bang, or are we looking at centuries-old poetic language reinterpreted to fit a 20th century discovery?
Thank you. Surah Al-Anbya 21:30 states, "Have those who disbelieved not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joint entity, and we separated them?" Surah Fussilat 41:11 describes the heavens as originally smooth before being formed into distinct layers. And Surah Adh-Dhariyat 51:47 states, "The heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed, we are its expander," using the Arabic root wasai, to expand. I want to be precise about the claim I'm making. I'm not arguing 7th century Arabia possessed astrophysics, or that this single argument proves the Quran's divine origin on its own. I'm arguing something narrower, a text without telescopes, spectroscopy, or general relativity describes a universe that began unified and gaseous, then separated, with an actively continuing expansion, language confirmed by physics only in the 20th century, over 1,000 years later. I'll also be honest about the internal Muslim critique here. Physicist Nidhal Gesum has warned against concordism, forcing scripture to match whatever science currently says, risking circular reasoning. I raise his caution myself, because I think this argument deserves scrutiny, not blind acceptance. My question for viewers, is a text describing a formerly unified cosmos, an active expansion, and a gaseous origin state, composed centuries before any observational basis existed for such claims, simply coincidence?
Thank you. Let's be precise about what the Big Bang actually is: a mathematically rigorous model built on general relativity, confirmed through Hubble's 1929 redshift data, the cosmic microwave background discovered in 1965, and precisely matching light element abundances from Big Bang nucleosynthesis. This isn't a vague intuition, it's decades of independently converging, falsifiable evidence. My objection to reading this into the Quran is methodological. Heavens and earth were joined, then separated, is an extremely general motive. The Babylonian Inma Elish, over 1,000 years before Islam, describes a god splitting a primordial being to form sky and earth. Separation cosmogonies were common cultural inheritance across the ancient Near East, the very region the Quran emerged from. On expansion, in 51:47, classical tafsir, written centuries before Hubble, generally read this as describing God's vast power or generosity, not metric spacetime expansion. That specific cosmological reading appears to be a 20th century reinterpretation, applied only after the discovery was already made. That's precisely the pattern methodologists call retrospective concordism, the same pattern my colleague's own cited source warns against. I'm not claiming coincidence is logically impossible, or that ancient texts can never contain compatible language. I'm arguing the evidential weight depends on whether an interpretation existed before the science confirmed it, and here, it doesn't appear to have. You cited Gesum's warning against concordism yourself. If a Muslim physicist within your own tradition flags this exact style of argument as methodologically risky, doesn't that significantly undercut the confidence with which this claim is often presented to popular audiences? I raised Gesum precisely because intellectual honesty requires presenting the strongest objection to my own position, not because I think it fully defeats the argument. His concern is about overreach, treating every scientific-sounding phrase as definitive proof, and risking embarrassment when scientific consensus shifts. I'm making a narrower claim. This is one suggestive data point within a much larger cumulative case for the Quran's origin, not a standalone, unfalsifiable proof. Even Gesum doesn't argue every instance of this genre is worthless. He argues for rigor, which is exactly the standard I'm trying to hold myself to here, rather than the standard some popular apologetic content applies. Surah Al-Kahf 18:86 describes the sun setting in a spring of dark murky water. Read plainly, that's a localized, flat Earth consistent picture, not a heliocentric solar system with a spherical Earth orbiting at astronomical distance. If the interpretive method used for 51:47 finds cosmic expansion, why doesn't the same plain reading method apply here? Fair challenge, and I won't dodge it. The majority of classical and modern exegetes read this as narrating Dhulkarnain's subjective visual observation at that coastal location, the sun appearing to set into the sea, exactly as anyone at a coastline describes it today, not the Quran asserting an objective astronomical claim in its own voice. That's a standard interpretive distinction in classical tafsir, narrated observed appearance versus direct scriptural assertion. I'll admit a skeptical reader may find that distinction more persuasive in some verses than others, and that's a legitimate tension within this whole genre I don't think should be papered over. The Big Bang model was first proposed in 1927 by Georges Lemaître, a Catholic priest, and was resisted for a time by physicists like Fred Hoyle partly because it felt uncomfortably close to a religious creation narrative. Doesn't that history suggest science and theology aren't as neatly separable as your opening implies? That's a fair historical point, and it's true, Hoyle did resist partly on those grounds, and Lemaître's religious background is real. But I'd separate individual scientists' psychology from the theory's evidential basis. The Big Bang is accepted today because of Hubble's redshift data, the CMB's precise thermal spectrum and nucleosynthesis ratios, independently tested by many research groups over nearly a century, not because of any theological resonance. Notably, Lemaître himself explicitly warned against using his physics as proof of Genesis, insisting on keeping the domains separate, a caution from exactly the person best positioned to make that call, which I think is worth taking seriously. Even today, general relativity's equations break down at the initial singularity. As a scientist, how do you personally account for the philosophical question of what, if anything, preceded or caused the Big Bang, given that current physics can't fully answer it? Honestly, this remains a genuinely open question, and good scientific practice requires saying so plainly. Frameworks like eternal inflation, cyclic bouncing models, and the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal have been proposed, but none has decisive observational conformation over the others, and near the Planck scale, even concepts like cause and time may not straightforwardly apply. My own position as a naturalist is that a current gap in physical knowledge doesn't license inserting a supernatural explanation by default. Historians of science call that pattern God of the gaps reasoning, and it has a poor track record, since many prior gaps were eventually filled by natural mechanisms. But I want to be precise, that's a philosophical stance about reasoning under uncertainty, not a scientific proof that no transcendent cause exists. That specific question sits outside what physics alone currently settles. The strongest point raised today, I think, was the observation that separation cosmogony motifs already existed across the ancient Near East for over a millennium before Islam, which raises a real parsimony question about whether the Quranic account reflects independent insight or shared regional inheritance. I take that seriously. Where I'd push back is on the specificity of the Quranic language, an ongoing, actively continuing expansion, not a one-time separation event, and a description of the primordial state specifically as smoke, a gaseous description, rather than the divided divine bodies or primordial waters typical of comparison cosmogonies. Whether that added specificity is enough to set the Quranic account apart from a more precise version of the same regional motif is, honestly, the single most important open question in this whole debate, and I don't think today's exchange fully resolves it either way. I want to honor the strongest point raised against my position, that apologetic overreach elsewhere doesn't invalidate this narrower, more careful version of the argument, and that even Gessun doesn't dismiss the whole enterprise outright. That's fair. My response is that even the careful version still requires the cosmological reading of Lamussian in 5147 to have existed as a live interpretation before Hubble's discovery, for the prediction framing to carry independent weight rather than functioning as reinterpretation after the fact. As best I understand the classical tafsir record, that specific reading wasn't the dominant pre-modern interpretation, and that timing gap is precisely what concerns me methodologically, regardless of how cautiously the argument is otherwise framed. I hope today's conversation has shown this is a genuinely difficult, contested question, not a slam dunk in either direction, whatever confident content on either side of this debate sometimes suggests online. The Quran's description of the heavens and earth as once joined, then separated, of the primordial state as smoke, and of an actively continuing cosmic expansion, these are, at minimum, not contradicted by, and arguably suggestive of, a cosmological model humanity had no independent way of confirming for over 1,000 years after the text's revelation. I've tried to present this honestly, including its real weaknesses, the pre-existence of separation cosmogonies regionally, the genuine risk of concordism that Muslim physicists themselves raise, and verses like the setting place of the sun, which require careful, consistent interpretive method to engage fairly rather than defensively, cherry-picking only the verses that seem to fit. I don't think this argument, standing alone, should be presented to anyone as decisive proof of divine origin, and I'd be doing this discussion a disservice to claim otherwise. What I've argued throughout is more modest, as one thread within a much larger tapestry of Islamic theological argument, the Quran's literary character, its historical preservation, its moral and legal teaching, the broader phenomenon of prophecy across the tradition. Does this cosmological correspondence add meaningful, if modest, evidential weight? Or is it fully and adequately explained by shared ancient cultural inheritance and the flexible, retrospective interpretive tendencies my colleague has rightly pressed me on throughout this conversation? I'd ask viewers to resist the temptation offered by confident voices on either extreme, those who present this as airtight scientific proof of the Quran's divine origin, and those who dismiss it instantly as obvious coincidence without engaging the specific textual details we discussed today. The honest answer, I think, sits somewhere in the genuine uncertainty between those two poles, and I'd rather leave you there than oversell my own case. I'd echo that spirit of honesty. What I hope has come through today is that my objection isn't a dismissal of Islamic scholarship's sincerity, nor a claim that ancient texts can never contain language later found compatible with scientific discovery. Some degree of retrospective compatibility, especially in flexible poetic language, is simply unsurprising and doesn't require an extraordinary explanation on its own. My position rests on a specific, testable methodological principle. Evidential weight in cases like this depends on whether an interpretation was available and dominant before the relevant scientific discovery, or constructed after it. The historical record of classical tafsir, as best I can determine, suggests the specific cosmological reading of expansion in Surah Adh-Dhariyat emerged largely in the 20th century, after Hubble, Lemaître, Penzias, and Wilson had already done the actual observational and theoretical work. Combined with the well-documented pre-existence of separation cosmogony motifs across the ancient Near East, I find the more parsimonious explanation to be retrospective reinterpretation of flexible language, rather than independent scientific foresight embedded in the 7th century. I want to close, though, by genuinely crediting something my colleague raised. This argument, honestly presented, as it has been today, isn't typically offered by careful scholars as standalone proof, but as one modest thread within a much broader theological and historical case, openly conceding its weaknesses rather than hiding them. I'd ask viewers to evaluate it on exactly those terms, as one contested data point, weighed seriously against the specific historical timing of its interpretation and the wider cultural context the Quran emerged from, not as conclusive confirmation, and not as something dismissible with a single counterexample either. That kind of careful, mutual weighing is, I think, what genuine dialogue between science and scripture actually requires, and I'd rather model that than score easy points.
Today you heard both sides laid out carefully and honestly, a scholar arguing for a striking, non-coincidental correspondence, and a scientist arguing that shared ancient cosmological motifs and after-the-fact reinterpretation explain the pattern just as well. No winner declared, just two rigorous cases, for you to weigh. Here's the question we'll leave you with: should an interpretation only count as real evidence if it existed before the science confirmed it, or can a text still be right even if we only recognized it later? Let us know your take in the comments. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning.